In 1976, a group of predominantly East African Asian women workers in London launched one of the iconic industrial disputes of the decade. For the next 2 years, the women fought against their employer, the police, the Labour government, the media, the court system, and the leadership of the trade union movement. While it didn't achieve its immediate goals, it was successful in galvanising a sea change in the workers' movement and the struggle against racism in the UK. This is Working Class History.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, 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 alla mattina.
Before we get started today, I need to explain something. Long-term listeners may recall our first ever episode being about the Grunwick strike, but like all of our earliest episodes, it was basically raw audio from our interview about the dispute, so the sound quality was pretty bad, and there was no narrative to fill in any gaps, explain context, and pull the story together. In addition to producing new podcast episodes, we're going to be going back over our earliest episodes to re-edit and release them in the new narrative format we use for all of our later episodes. And this is our third re-edited and re-released episode now, so the interview audio will have the same quality as before, but there'll be extra audio clips from participants who were involved at the time, as well as added narrative with better quality audio to explain things better and hopefully tell the story in a more cohesive way. The original interview audio isn't the best quality because we didn't really know what we were doing at the time, and we recorded it in an absolutely freezing union office in northwest London, round the corner from where the strike happened. It was so cold we had to have an electric heater blasting, which affected the audio quality. But especially with the new narrative and good quality clips, we think it should be good enough for listeners to enjoy and get something out of, which we hope that you do. Also, just a quick reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive access to podcast episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merch and other content. For example, our Patreon supporters can listen to both parts of this double episode now. Join us or find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. As with all of our stories, the strike at Grunwick didn't appear out of thin air.
But what we've also got to remember is that Grunwick didn't just happen out of the blue, There were a whole series of dozens of Asian and Black worker strikes. And in almost all of these strikes, workers had to face the racism either of co-workers or more often of the union hierarchy.
This is Amrit Wilson. Amrit is a writer, activist, and member of the South Asia Solidarity Group, who was heavily involved in organising support for the Grunwick strikers. Amrit is also author of the book, Finding a Voice, Asian Women in Britain, which was first published in 1978, but has recently been republished in a new expanded edition.
I think this context that Amrit's talking about is really important because one thing I always get asked is, why, if there was this context of the trade unions effectively scabbing on a lot of Black and Asian workers' strikes before Grunwick, why did they change their minds at Grunwick? And I think it's an absolutely crucial question. And I think you can only really answer it if you understand this context.
This is Sujata. Sujata was the chair of the Grunwick 40 group, which commemorated the dispute on its 40th anniversary between 2016 and 2018. These strikes which preceded Grunwick are really important in order to understand the context in which the Grunwick strike occurred and how transformative it was. There is a fair bit of ground to cover, so I'm going to be speaking quite a bit in the first half of part one, but please rest assured I'm soon going to be shutting up and you're going to hear lots more from our interviewees and people who were involved at the time. For non-UK listeners, just to clarify that in standard UK terminology, the term Asian typically refers to people of South Asian descent, and that's how it's used in this episode. What is generally considered the first significant strike of Black, Asian and migrant workers of the period was the Red Scar Mill strike in Preston in 1965. Its story, as well as the story of other similar strikes of the period, is told in the excellent book The Making of the Black Working Class in Britain by Ron Ramdin, available on the link in the show notes. Sujata mentioned two key disputes which occurred after this. The first of them was the Mansfield hosiery strike, which took place in Loughborough in 1972. First off, in November, around 250 Indian men and 50 women walked out on strike at the mill for higher wages and for promotion rights to jobs which were reserved for white workers. A few days later, 80 more women workers at a subsidiary factory joined them. As one of the women explained, they did this because, quote, "The colour bar applies to us all. If our brothers are on strike, we have to give them support. They need to feel self-respect. When they are treated like dogs, how can we go in if our brothers are out?" End quote. Colour bar was standard terminology referring to racial segregation in employment. In the UK, it wasn't as formalised as, say, in the US under Jim Crow or apartheid South Africa, but it was a fact of life in many places. So, for example, at Mansfield Hosiery, the lowest paid jobs like cutting were almost all done by Asian women at piecework rates, whereas more senior jobs paying regular salaries were done by white women. Elsewhere, colour bars were sometimes formalised, like on the buses in Bristol, where white workers in the Transport and General Workers Union, TGWU, now part of Unite, pressured their employer to ban black and Asian workers from being hired. This was overturned in 1963 following a bus boycott organised by black residents in the city. But more informal colour bars persisted, and often did so with the agreement of the trade unions. At Mansfield Hosiery, for example, the union, the National Union of Hosiery and Knitwear Workers, refused to back the strike until eventually it was forced to do so following the occupation of its offices by the strikers. However, the union still refused to call out its white members, who in any case benefited from the discrimination against Indians with better opportunities for promotion. The dispute ended in December with the workers winning concessions. Then, a couple of years later in 1974, hundreds of mostly East African Asian women workers walked out on strike at the Imperial Typewriters factory in Leicester. The strike was partly over a bonus scheme for which they were being underpaid, and it was also about discrimination Asian workers experienced compared with white colleagues. So while about 1,100 of the 1,600 workers were Asian, the union reps, shop stewards, were white, and the Asian workers were unable to elect their own representatives. And as in the case of black auto workers in Detroit, we talk about in our episodes 61 to 62, workplace regulations, disciplinaries and so on were applied in very uneven ways between white workers, who were treated relatively leniently, and workers of colour, who were treated much more harshly. The strikers got a lot of support from the local Asian community, but not really from anywhere else. The local branch of the Fascist National Front harassed the strikers, police arrested several of them, and the employer sacked most of the strikers, and their union, the TGWU, denounced them. Their negotiator, George Bromley, who was also an activist in the local Labour Party, said the following of the workers, and I hope that listeners will forgive me for repeating his racist language. Quote, "The workers have not followed the proper disputes procedure. They have no legitimate grievances, and it's difficult to know what they want. I think there are racial tensions, but they're not between the whites and the coloureds. The tensions are between those Asians from the subcontinent and those from Africa. In a civilised society, the majority view will prevail. Some people must learn how things are done." End quote. Bromley also made the preposterous claim that the strike was organised by the Chinese Communist Party. Eventually, the strike was defeated, but it helped further inspire the Asian, black and migrant working class to organise and fight for their own interests.
These strikes were getting increasingly militant, and you really saw that this black and Asian workforce in this country was one of the most militant sections of the working class. And they were effectively outside of the control of the trade union movement and the establishment.
The establishment's fear of this autonomous, self-organised Asian and black working class was very real. Asian workers had started to form self-organised groups like the Indian Workers Association. And after the Mansfield Hosiery strike, a government commission of inquiry wrote a report detailing union complicity in racist practices and warned that if unions didn't desist in their racism, then black and Asian workers would form their own unions. On top of this wave of strikes, it's also important to understand the general political environment in the UK at the time.
The miners' strike of 74 actually got rid of the Heath government. And so you have the resurgent left at that point.
The Conservative government of Edward Heath had been brought down by a strike of coal miners, after which first Labour's Harold Wilson became Prime Minister, followed by James Callaghan in 1976. The traditional, mostly white working class was very well organised and had won a lot of improvements to pay and conditions since the end of World War II. Economic inequality and absolute poverty were at their lowest levels in history. Basically all things which are part of the reasons the British right today hate the 1970s and constantly bang on about it.
When we came to 1976, we had what was a very right-wing Labour government who had this kind of corporatist ideal of the social contract, where they like to sit down with business and trade union leaders and have tea and sandwiches and get everybody to agree and say, you don't go on strike and we've got unemployment and inflation and we've all got to work together. So there was this kind of need to kind of incorporate anything that could be deemed militant into that fold and make sure that it could all be controlled within the social contract. So I think that the trade unions were very scared that, you know, some group of militant workers weren't going to come along and, you know, blow a lid on their nice plans and their nice arrangements that they'd cooked up with business leaders.
So with this background, where white workers were pretty well organised with relatively good paying conditions, many employers tried to save money by hiring recent migrant workers, giving them the worst jobs and paying them much less than white colleagues. And rather than join together with black and Asian workers to win higher pay for everyone, many white workers and unions instead chose to try to defend pay differentials and promotional opportunities for themselves only, not realising that this just enabled lower pay for everyone overall. One plant which had hired large numbers of migrant workers was Grunwick Film Processing Laboratories in northwest London, with around 400 employees.
Grunwick factory had quite a reputation before the strike broke out. It had quite a reputation of poor wages, poor conditions, and also of the owners being very anti-union. There had actually been, before the strike in 1976, there had been an attempt to organise by some of the delivery drivers, and that was unsuccessful, and they were all dismissed at that time. And so Grunwick was known locally as a firm that didn't like unions. The owner, George Ward, was known as very anti-union. And some of the conditions in the factory were described by the local MP at the time as sweatshop conditions. There were things like women not being given time off to go to doctor's appointments when they were pregnant. They were overlooked by their manager in a kind of glass office, overlooking their work and kind of, you know, bullied into working faster and faster. At one point in the factory, they had to put up their hands to go to the toilet. And so it was really a kind of, you know, indignity upon dignity. It was this kind of, it wasn't kind of one big incident that provoked the strike. If you like, it was a kind of succession of kind of incidents of bullying and petty humiliations. And I think combined with very low wages, I think the average wage at the time in the processing department where the strike started was £28 a week. And that compared, I think, to an average at the time of £40 a week.
While £28 a week was considerably lower than the pay for an average woman manual worker at the time, which was £44 a week, it was particularly tiny compared to the average wage nationally in Britain at that time, which was £72 a week. Around 10% of the workers at Grunwick were white, 10% Afro-Caribbean, and the rest were of Indian and Pakistani descent.
The workforce who were employed at Grunwick were mainly people who had fled from East Africa, had a very hard time in getting to Britain because of the policies of the then Labour government. And then found themselves in a completely alien situation where they had been, most of them had been middle class. So the men found it very hard to do the types of jobs which were available, which were anyway quite few in number. Some of them managed to find sort of reasonable jobs, but the women then added to the family income by taking on sweatshop work.
While some South Asian people had lived in Africa for a long time, the number expanded significantly during the period of British colonial rule, especially in East African countries like the ones which are now called Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Britain used Indian soldiers to conquer and suppress rebellions in Africa, and used large numbers of Asian workers to construct and staff railways which they built to help plunder local resources. While all British colonial subjects across the empire held British passports, this didn't entitle them to equal treatment, and colonial authorities implemented highly racist structures. And while most Asians in British East Africa were on average better off with more social and economic advantages than Africans, they were still colonial subjects who were discriminated against heavily. For example, in public services, senior posts were reserved for Europeans only, and European and Asian public sector workers had different rights. So after these colonies gained independence, the new governments implemented measures to try to reverse the decades of hyper-discrimination against Africans. So in Kenya, for example, European and Asian settlers were given 2 years to give up their British passports and adopt Kenyan citizenship. But most of the 180,000 Asians in Kenya chose not to give up their British passports. As a result, many were fired from jobs when the policy of Africanization was implemented. In Uganda, the dictator Idi Amin ordered the expulsion of all 80,000 Asians from the country. As British subjects and passport holders, many chose to flee to the UK. But as Amrit mentioned, getting to Britain wasn't easy. Anticipating arrivals of significant numbers of Asian refugees and migrants, the Labour government introduced the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1968. Labour claimed that the law wasn't racial, but secret papers released decades later showed that it purposely targeted, quote, coloured immigrants, end quote, and Cabinet was even advised that the bill would breach international law. A confidential memo to Prime Minister Harold Wilson said that they could argue, quote, the Asian community in East Africa are not nationals of this country in any racial sense, and that the obligations imposed, for example, by the European Convention on Human Rights do not therefore apply, end quote. Though most Conservative MPs voted for the law, even the Conservative Times newspaper described it as, quote, probably the most shameful measure that Labour members have ever been asked by their whips to support, end quote. Tory Lord Ian Gilmore, who opposed the bill, described its purpose very straightforwardly to journalist Mark Latimer, quote, to keep the blacks out, end quote. As we discuss in our episodes 33 to 34, at the time in the UK, all people of colour were considered black, from Afro-Caribbean to Asian to Chinese to Australian Aboriginal peoples. But despite the law, a good number of Asians did manage to come to the UK, and many employers were happy to hire them on poor pay and conditions.
I think the owners of Grunwick were very explicit about the fact that they wanted to employ these types of women because they thought that they were very passive and that they would accept the kind of wages that were being offered, and they wouldn't be able to get other people to do this kind of work.
If a white woman came and say, no, love, this isn't for you because we can't pay the wages which would keep you here. We don't have the conditions which would keep you here. So it was it was pretty blatant.
One of these workers was Jayaben Desai, who was interviewed by Chris Thomas in 2007 for his excellent documentary, The Great Grunwick Strike, who kindly let us use extracts of his interviews in these episodes.
I worked with them as a part-time worker, and slowly and gradually I saw that mostly the English girls they were working, they left, and they replaced it by the Indian people. Afterward, I heard that they have put the posters door to door that we will no discriminate people, we can employ it, come here, we will give you employment, and that type of leaflets they have put door to door, and so many people they were applying there one after another. If I go there and I bring my friends, that way all they were came into that factory, and most of the people they were Indian now. English girls they were talking about that, look, this is not the place. We want our social hours as well. We are not working after social 5 o'clock. and they were pushing them to work more after our overtime. And they were telling that no, we are, and that they were telling them as well, look, this is not the place for you. So they were leaving, and a replacement by our people.
Workers were forced to work overtime constantly, and that was only just one of the problems with how workers at the plant were treated.
That was very rude because they were telling so many people that, look, this is not the time to go for the doctors. Some ladies were going to the doctors and they said, look, somebody would be at home, the family member, they can take your child to the doctor. Why you are going absent for that? So many things they were doing. The toilet also, we have to ask him. If he give the permission, then we can go to the toilet. Then somebody told that the women, they are staying there long time. A lot of things that they were doing.
Discipline at the company was also harsh and arbitrary.
After September, when the business was low, he was sacking. Who was not good enough, he was sacking by any hook or crook. Any reason he was finding out. You drop the paper and you sack. You are 5 minutes late and you are sacked. In the same way he was sacking. So everybody was afraid about that if our turn will come and he will sack us. So everybody in fear, they were working hard and hard and hard. And then he applied the one system that he was writing the name on the board. Who was working hard and make more packets, whose name was on the top. And who has done less, his name was on the down. So psychologically, he was attacking on the people that, look, if you are doing less work, you are the first person who would be sacked by him.
Eventually, on the 20th of August 1976, came the straw that broke the camel's back, and the strike began.
The strike started very small. It started with four workers walked out of the factory one afternoon. One was sacked and 3 others walked out with him. Later on that evening, Jayaben Desai, who became the leader of the strike, was asked to do overtime and refused, and got into a confrontation with a notoriously difficult and oppressive manager. Walked out of the strike and took her son with her, who was also working at the factory.
I told him, look, I'm leaving now. I don't work with you anymore. And I'm the person who leaving and give my card straight away. I don't want to work with you in this situation. That's what I told him. And I left.
Jayaben's son, Sunil, earlier that day had been reprimanded by a manager after he got tickled by a colleague who told him, "This is not a zoo." When Sunil walked out in support of his mum, what he said to the manager became an iconic phrase associated with the dispute.
My son said, and he said, look, you told me in afternoon this is not zoo, but this is the zoo, you are running zoo. There is a lot of monkey who can dance on your fingertips. There is a lot of people who are doing according what he wants. He said that, look, there is a lot of monkeys who can dance on your fingertips, but I am lion. I can chop your head like that and I prove it.
Workers who'd been either sacked or walked out then had a chat in the car park outside straight afterwards.
When I came outside, I saw that boys outside standing. I said, look, you are the boys who were stuck outside? Yes. And afternoon he said, yes, we are not going to. I said, what are you doing here up to now? He said, look, we are not going to go away before anything doing. We are going to break his glasses, window glasses, and his guards and everything. We are going to break it. I said, don't do that. You will damage yourself. You can call the police and all this is insured by him. It doesn't happen to anything to him, but you will damage yourself. Why don't you do something else? What we can do? I say, we can organize ourselves and we can do union, because my husband was working with union that time. And he told me a lot of things at home. When I was coming home, on the dining table, we were talking about, look, this is happening, and say, if you need union in your company, they can't do these things with union. And that's what it was in my mind. I said, look, we can make union here. He said, we don't know anything. I said, no, I don't know anything also, but we can find out.
At the time, they didn't know anything really about trade unions, how they operated, and how they worked. But over the weekend, kind of started thinking about it, doing a bit of research and talking to people.
Wondering what to do, the workers headed to the Citizens Advice Bureau.
Citizens Advice Bureau said you need to join a trade union. And so they joined the Apex trade union, which was a fairly respectable, professional, white-collar workers union, who then made this strike official.
It's worth remembering that Apex was actually a fairly right-wing union. And the fact that they joined Apex did, I think, make a bit of a difference, because Apex were very reluctant to really take any kind of militant action.
Making the decision to strike wasn't easy, especially for women members of the Hindu Gujarati community.
I think it was very difficult because a lot of them had never worked outside the home. Some may have done some sort of accountancy work or something, connected to their husband's work, but they hadn't really worked independently. So there was a great reluctance. There was also issues of patriarchy where women are not supposed to take a stand or be militant or speak out. But they did change over the course of the strike, but that made it that much harder for them to join the strike. And then there were other aspects as well. One thing you've got to remember, that this was a very particular community. I mean, it had been comparatively middle class or middle strata in Africa, in East African countries. They were the sort of sandwich between Africans and white people, because, essentially they would talk to the Africans. And so they had imbibed a lot of the sense of superiority which went with that. And, all of these factors meant that, they were not essentially like, not only were they not political, but they were not of a class which normally takes part in political action. So I think, it was very, very difficult for them. There was a feeling that they shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. There was a sense of shame that they would be going out and demanding their rights, because then people would know that they were doing these jobs.
Some people got the family pressure as well, and some people lost the hope as well. This is no good to stand outside. Some told me as well, some told my husband as well, that this is not good. Women, they are standing on a picket line, is no good. The community, Indian community, all never done this type of things in their life. Only Gandhi time, the women's, they were on picket line. And that's the very few people knows that, because the recently who came from East Africa, they don't know the history of India. I know all these things, so I take that initiative, and I have no fear and no shame on that picket line.
Despite these issues, the small group of initial strikers managed to sign up more and more people to join the union and the walkout.
Ask everybody going inside to join union, and everybody sign on the paper of the computer paper, because we don't know anything what to do. So we ask them to sign that you are ready to join union, and everybody gives sign.
The following weeks, more came out on strike. The strikers began to get strike pay. They got the support of Apex and the local trade union movement. And it started to become a big thing.
There are also some drivers and some black guys and some Indian girls. All they joined with them, and all together nearly 70, 80 people were there.
Between them, they were able to keep up a rotating picket line to balance picket duties with personal and family lives.
2 hours their service will do and they can go easily because many people was on picket line. So every 2 hours we were calling one person, and 1 hour before time the another 2 person will come. Then the 2 people will leave after 1 hour. So continuous the picket line was there.
The workers elected a strike committee and agreed formal demands, a central one of which was formal recognition of their union at the plant, Apex. Soon, nearly 150 workers had joined the strike, and Grunwick retaliated by firing all of them, with the company offering to rehire them only if they gave up their demand for union recognition. Apex then requested support from the main UK union federation, the Trades Union Congress, TUC.
At that time, solidarity action was quite a common thing. It wasn't outlawed like it is today. And so other workers started to think about how they could build solidarity with the Grunwick workers.
Solidarity, or sympathy action as it's sometimes known, was common before the 1980s in Britain, when workers were much more likely to win disputes. It refers to when one group of workers walk out on strike in support of another group. Banning solidarity action was one of the main tools used by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in the 1980s and 90s to create the situation we have today, where the working class is much weaker and more atomised. This ban was never repealed by Labour once they regained power. After the dispute began, not much happened at first in terms of intervention from the official trade union movement.
Initially, there was very little reaction. But after they went around actually talking to people in their workplaces, that made a huge difference. Also, the unions were not really able to conceive of a situation where low-paid workers in a sweatshop would fight back. They just were not able to comprehend this or how you move forward.
But then the Grunwick workers had an idea.
They thought of directly approaching rank and file workers, and they had this big tour around the country.
Yeah, the committee was deciding who will go and where to go. Sometimes the boys will go, some girls were with them. Sometimes I have to go and boys also with me. But everywhere I can't go myself. So I give everybody chance.
The strikers started building support pretty much around the country for what they were doing. And effectively, one of the ways that they managed to build such support was they weren't reliant on regional or national trade union officials. They organised a speaking tour to go right round the country, which effectively is, I was going to say, over the heads of the kind of, trade union bureaucrats, but effectively it was under them. And spoke to grassroots trade unionists themselves rather than relying on the big machines to kind of build that kind of support. Other trade unions started to look at other groups of workers started to look at what sort of solidarity action they could bring. And one of the most important ones there was the local post office workers. Grunwick was a mail order company. It used to process films. So way back in the 70s, when you used to get your little canisters of film and send them off in those envelopes to get your photos processed, they used to end up at a factory like Grunwick. So the whole business was based around mail order. So when the postal office workers said, actually, we're going to black Grunwick's mail, we're not going to take it out and we're not going to deliver it. Now, that could have brought that company down.
Colum Maloney was a postal worker who was also the chairman of the local Cricklewood branch of the Union of Post Office Workers, UPW. Chris Thomas also interviewed him back in 2007, and he explained how the boycott came about.
Grunwick, it was in Chapter Road, which came under the postal area, which Cricklewood was responsible to deliver the mail in. And my drivers and walking postmen who attempted to deliver mail there on a regular basis, we were reporting back quite regularly that the management of that particular company i.e. George Ward and Grunwick, were not prepared to allow what was a parliamentary right of the individuals working there to belong to a trade union. And they felt that we as a sister union should do something to assist the strikers at that particular company. We wanted to make sure that we didn't affect other businesses in that area, which meant that people working there would be affected as well. So we decided that we would not deliver the mail to Grunwick on the basis that they were not acting in a proper and reasonable and lawful way. And we could do that by refusing to deliver or indeed to accept mail from Grunwick. Our response to the picket line was that we gave instructions to our drivers and our delivery persons not to cross the line. And that was agreed at a meeting of all the members in the office.
Oh, it was beautiful, I think. They take the decision and they stopped the post union Grunwick post, and there were a pile of bags was untouched from them.
The boycott was hugely powerful.
And in fact, while it was going on, George Ward, the owner himself, said that the company would have been ruined within weeks if that action had continued. So there was a huge move towards action and solidarity.
Faced with defeat, an outside organisation came to the aid of Grunwick management in the form of a group with the amusing acronym NAF, the National Association for Freedom. For US listeners, NAF basically means crap or tacky. NAF took legal action against the UPW, arguing that the boycott violated the 1953 Post Office Act. Most observers considered legal action was a long shot because the law had never been used before to block industrial action in the postal service, but regardless, the UPW agreed to call off the action in return for Grunwick management agreeing to meet with the Government Conciliation Service ACAS, an agreement which, it's worth pointing out, meant absolutely nothing to Grunwick workers. The intervention of NAF upped the stakes of what had been a small, local industrial dispute.
When the National Association for Freedom intervened, who were, very, very right-wing, I think they're the forerunners of what we know today as the Freedom Association. They had John Gorst in Parliament, Margaret Thatcher, and so on. It became a political dispute with a big P. Mm-hmm. And at that point, there was people really felt that they had to kind of step up, and that it was that side that were making it political with a big P, and they had to respond. So I think that was a very important part of why the trade unions backed Grunwick at a kind of high level. Because they were really worried about what would happen if they didn't. So the response was these mass days of action, these really, really enormous pickets that were happening outside the factory. And the owners of the factory, of course, were hiring buses to bring in scabs in order to continue doing business.
The workers were taken aback by how many people showed up to support them for the first mass picket.
I didn't expect that much, but it was so much people, so many people, 5,000 people, I think. More than that, the 5 miles area was banned.
That was unbelievable. See that whole sea of people behind you. It's just overpowering. It's just unbelievable that a small little post office like ours in Cricklewood, a small little group of Asian women and men in a small dingy little factory in Chapter Road could raise that sort of solidarity and support.
Amrit had quickly become a supporter of the strikers and took part in many of these pickets.
Because of my political stance, I was supporting them anyway. But I was also working as a freelance journalist at the time. And I was also writing a book about South Asian women. So I went to the picket line quite early on, in 76 actually, and met that not much was going on at the time. It was comparatively quiet. And I talked to some of the strikers and talked to Jayaben Desai. And she said, oh, you must come every day and all of this. And I did come, a few times at that point. But I couldn't come every day because I had childcare issues at the time. And, it's not possible. So she said to me, look, you could be a lot more useful if you actually write about the strike. Because we're not getting the kind of publicity we want. And also, nobody is writing about racism. And she emphasized this point that, there's absolutely nothing. So please do tell the truth on this, So I was, obviously really fired up. I wanted to do this. And then she said, come to my house and we'll talk there. So I went to her place over that whole year several times. And we talked about a whole lot of different issues and about the strike and about the community, how it was responding, and so on and so on. And we became very good friends. Talking about the problem, a whole lot of problems of actually correctly representing Asian women's lives, and Asian workers' lives as well.
Seppellire lassù in montagna, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Seppellire lassù in montagna, sotto l'ombra di un bel fiore.
That brings us to the end of part 1. In part 2, we talk more with Amrit and Sujata and hear more from Colum and Jayaben Desai about how the strike developed, the lengths authorities went to try to crush it, and how the dispute changed the workers' movement. Our Patreon supporters can listen to that now. For everyone else, it will be out in the next couple of weeks. It's only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as exclusive bonus episodes, discounted merch, and much more. If you can't spare the cash, absolutely no problem. But please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app like Apple or Spotify. If you want to learn more about the struggles of migrant workers in Britain around this time, we definitely recommend the book The Making of the Black Working Class in Britain by Ron Ramdin. You can get it on the link in the show notes. And as a listener to the podcast, you can get 10% off it or anything else in our online store using the discount code WCHPodcast. As always, we've got sources, links to more info, photos, transcripts, further reading, and more on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. There, we're also going to pop a link where you can watch Chris Thomas's excellent documentary. Thanks again to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Stone Lawson. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Tyler Hill. Finally, thanks to all of you for listening. Catch you next time.